Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willie. Today, my friend Dan McCarthy joins us for a wide-ranging discussion on the origin of cultural issues, the tensions between the establishment wing and the populist wing of the Republican Party, and our leaders' efforts to manage the electoral backlash when their failures become too great to ignore. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I am so pleased to welcome my guest today, Daniel McCarthy, a friend of mine who I met in Washington, D.C., who is joining us from Alexandria, Virginia. Daniel McCarthy is vice president for the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and the editor-in-chief of Modern Age, a conservative review. He is also a columnist for the Spectator World and the author of the introduction to a new edition of The Conservative Affirmation by Wilmore Kendall, one of the founding fathers of the conservative movement. The Conservative Affirmation is out this week from Regnery Publishing. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paige. It's a great pleasure to join you.
So my first topic that I want to address with you is cultural issues. And a lot of conservative pundits and commentators have leaned into issues such as transgenderism and abortion and critical race theory being taught in schools. And they proudly call this taking on the culture war. They're finally pleased that Republicans are willing to take on issues where it feels like we've lost a lot of ground. And of course, the press calls this pejoratively the culture war. So you've got two different elements of that terminology going on. Republicans are proud of it. The press is dismissing it as frivolous and silly. And personally, I chafe at the quote-unquote cultural issue framing simply because I'm not even convinced that a cultural issue really exists. The longer I've been in politics, the more I am convinced that everything we encounter that affects political debate is categorized more accurately as economic issues, representation issues, or simply propaganda. And so what we call cultural issues to me seems like a proxy war for how much say citizens still have in their affairs. Drag Queen Story Hour, while disgusting, is eventually less about the drag queen and more about whether normal people are powerless over what happens at their local library. Do you think cultural issues exist, and how do you see the relationship between culture and politics?
Well, I think you framed that absolutely brilliantly and accurately. And it's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to as well, because the real question from my mind is not, how do we have things like Drag Queen Story Hour happening, but rather, what is it that allows these things to become possible in the first place? You are always going to have some eccentrics as librarians or as school teachers who might have, some really left-wing lesson plan, or who might, want to advertise their sexuality to their students. You expect some of those things to happen just as, sort of random chaotic motion. But something instead has gone systematically wrong, which has allowed these kinds of people to be promoted to positions of authority over children, over local public libraries, and all across the board. And I think a lot of conservatives, framing it as you suggest in terms of the culture war, they look at this and they say, well, it's just a sort of radical left-wing culture which has come from higher education, it's come from the academy, and it has now infiltrated all parts of our society. And that's true. That's partly true. But there's clearly another part to it as well. So think about, for example, the way in which gender confusion and transsexualism is being imposed upon young children right now. We're seeing Chris Rufo, for example, report on things like, children's hospitals that are now performing hysterectomies on underage children because they're saying, well, these young girls, they have gender dysphoria and they're really boys. How do we get to a point as a country where this kind of thing is happening in the first place? We can be outraged once we learn about it, but if it's already going on and something set this up so that it was taking place before we even got upset about it, clearly the mistake was earlier in the chain of command, earlier in the chain of authority than any of us have expected. And it seems to me that, first of all, you've already had a medicalization of childhood that everyone has accepted over the last 25 or 30 years, which starts with things like ADD and ADHD, attention deficit disorder. It extends to things like saying that children are on the autism spectrum. Now, some of these are real diseases. Don't get me wrong there. But we've certainly seen a massive amount of overdiagnosis and an increased amount of diagnosis of children having all of these psychiatric conditions, such that when now progressives come in and they say, well, not only are your children on the autism spectrum, not only do they have ADHD, they also are going to suffer from gender dysphoria. People have been conditioned to accept these diagnoses and to say, aha, This is coming from medical science. The authority of medical science is something that we can't possibly reject. And therefore, even if, in terms of common sense, it just doesn't add up to say that all these young children are in fact members of the opposite sex from what, sort of their biology and what their genes would tell you. That no, in fact, these enlightened scientists who have also told us about the behavioral problems of our children are now telling us that our children have sexual problems. And to the wider point about, the relative influence of these larger structures of economics and social authority, even before you get to the point of particular outrages like Drag Queen Story Hour, this was something that someone like Senator Joseph McCarthy, who, by the way, wasn't a relative of mine, but certainly the names lead plenty of my critics to suggest that I'm reviving McCarthyism. But Senator Joseph McCarthy, early on in the Cold War, he was, of course, famously concerned about the infiltration of communists into our government. And one of the things that brought Senator Joseph McCarthy down is that towards the end of his search for communists in government, he started looking at the U.S. Army. And he noticed that, for example, there was an army dentist who had been a Communist Party member. His name was Perez. And Joe McCarthy made a point that the real scandal here was not that this communist dentist happened to get a promotion while he was in the army. The question was rather who promoted Perez, and that became a famous slogan for the post-war right for several years. And this is the point at which Joe McCarthy, by the way, gets taken out by the establishment. Basically, he is demonized by everyone, and it's at the point when he starts going after the intelligence agencies, the deep state, the army. And of course, subsequently, you have organizations like the John Birch Society, which are talking about these same issues. And of course, they're always marginalized. And when I bring up these examples, I'm not saying that Joe McCarthy was right about all of his accusations, or even necessarily most of them. I'm certainly not saying that, an organization like the John Birch Society is correct in its particular conspiracy theories. What I am saying, though, is that the point at which these people who raise uncomfortable questions for the establishment get thrown out into the outer darkness is precisely the point when they start looking at, who promoted whom, what kind of chain of authority led to, the presence of low-level communists in government, what kind of chain of authority led to things like Drag Queen Story Hour. And it's because when you start raising these questions, even if your theory is wrong, just the fact that you're starting to unwind that thread to follow those clues and to discover what kind of network is behind the scenes, that is something the establishment does not want to do. And it's not just because the establishment might be, as nefarious as some of the conspiracy theorists believe, but it's simply because the establishment wants to cover its own backside. It wants to continue to have the authority to control our society without being identified, explicitly with wielding the amount of power that it actually has. And so by, ridiculing and demonizing and exiling anyone who tries to call into question these structures, that's how the establishment is able to maintain power. And again, I don't want to use the word establishment as if I'm talking about a particular group of people in a small smoke-filled room who are setting out an agenda for the whole country. I mean, some of that, a little bit takes place, but it's not even that it necessarily has to be that concrete. It's rather that you have a system of people who keep reinforcing one another's authority. They are like a social network in reality. They are people who, sort of have a commonality of deep commitments in terms of their values. And so as a result, and when they think about just the logic of their actions, they understand how that logic interacts with everyone else and creates a network whose network effects and power is much greater than the power of an actual conscious, individual trying to change things.
That's exactly right. And I appreciate that you are always ready with a couple historical examples to illustrate the points that you're speaking about. I think that really it helps people understand that these are not new and spontaneous developments. A lot of times these are things that you can trace back. You can unwind the thread, just as you say. So a new edition of an important book was released this week. I congratulate you. You've written the introduction to this book about it's a new edition of The Conservative Affirmation by Wilmore Kendall. And as I said in my introduction, you describe him as a founding father of the conservative movement. Yes, there, up on the screen. And we will, of course, link to it in the show notes. So reading from the book synopsis. Maverick political scientist Wilmore Kendall predicted the triumph of conservatism. Upon the 1963 publication of Kendall's The Conservative Affirmation, his former Yale student William F. Buckley Jr. called him, quote, one of the most superb and original political analysts of the 20th century. But even Buckley shook his head at what appeared to be Kendall's, quote, baffling optimism. During the 60s, Kendall stood apart from the mainstream conservative movement, which he accused of being anti-populist and of, quote, storming American public opinion from without by wrongly assuming that the American people were essentially corrupt and, quote, always ready to sell their votes to the highest bidder. Kendall believed that Americans would come to actively realize the conservatism which they had always actually lived. What do our listeners need to know about William Kendall? What drew you to his insights about the conservative movement? And what trends in the movement was he arguing against at his time?
Yeah, as I'm sure your listeners and viewers know, progressives have for a very long time told conservatives that America is a fundamentally liberal country, that it was founded on liberal premises, that a certain elite who had a correct understanding of natural rights has always been in charge of our country, and that conservatives have always properly been anti-democratic. And when progressives say that, what they mean is two things. First of all, they say, well, you conservatives are really supposed to be about defending monarchy, defending, sort of the old European order, and therefore there's something fundamentally un-American about conservatism itself. It's really about crowned heads and throne and altar, and it's not about the American tradition in particular. And if you conservatives want to defend the American tradition, that means what you're really defending is, in fact, liberalism, and a liberalism of natural rights derived from John Locke and so forth. The great thing about Wilmore Kendall is that he exposes that mythology and completely debunks it. He shows that, in fact, first of all, that John Locke was not necessarily quite as liberal as today's progressives would like to say, but more importantly, that the American political tradition has always been about self-government. It's never been about, having this massive alienation and break with the classical, sort of political tradition of Europe. We do things differently here, and we do have a more explicit kind of self-government among the people. But Wilmore Kendall was aware that, in fact, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, all of these great documents of the American political tradition were designed to promote self-government among a virtuous people, among a people who were generally of, Christian commitments, and that if you had a virtuous people with these kinds of commitments under God, they would be able to govern themselves, in a manner that anyone from the history of Western civilization could point to and say, aha, this is a good form of government. And it was not about having a set of intellectuals come in and conceive of a particular set of rights, which would then trump any kind of self-government that the public might want to follow. It was rather that if the public is virtuous under God, it will be able to govern itself very well, and the public itself will therefore have a correct understanding of rights and will follow that. And Kendall was not foolish. He believed that, you will have differences of opinion among the public. That's why you need to have deliberative institutions that bring together people of different points of view, and they will have discussions and they will come to conclusions, as they have, both arguments with one another, try to persuade one another using reason. And ultimately, you wind up with a vote which produces one outcome or another outcome. It doesn't have to be, done by some sort of, backroom deal. It can actually be done by people saying, well, look, 51% say this, 49% say that. Conservatives look at this and they get worried, as soon as they see all of these, this idea of democracy being thrown out there, because, democracy has a bad reputation going back to Plato. Democracy to a lot of conservatives means, aha, this means the poor and people who have less property are going to vote to give themselves all the property of the few people, the minority that has, more wealth in the country. There certainly are all of these pitfalls with democracy, and Wilmore Kendall was not a defender of sort of direct and unmoderated democracy. But Kendall points out that even when our Constitution is putting certain restraints upon the popular will, it's using the popular will itself in order to create those restraints. And in particular, our kind of self-government is localized self-government, where local communities and the states have the first degree of power. And they're the ones who have the first and most important decisions on things like, for example, the scope of speech rights and, how religion is going to be treated in public. These are primarily local questions. They're primarily state questions. And even things like the First Amendment were not necessarily created in order to have an enlightened federal government come in and try to dictate terms to the localities. Now, I'm doing a bad job because these are very subtle arguments of expressing, sort of all the brilliant, arguments that Wilmore Kendall is deploying. But this is why I had to write a new introduction for this book. Even though the book was published in 1963, it's actually more relevant today because it is like the philosophy and the theoretical framework that shows how the Constitution not only supports populism, but actually the Constitution depends upon populism. And so all of these populist conservatives right now were being told, not just by progressives, but also by a lot of miseducated conservatives, populism is not conservative. You are, you're not sufficiently elitist. And again, a real conservatism is actually kind of un-American because it's all European and it's all about monarchy or what have you. Wilmore Kendall provides you with the theoretical answers, the deep philosophy you need to rebut all of those claims being made by the progressives and being made by neocons and others, and to say, actually, the American political tradition, going back not just to the Constitution, but to the Mayflower Compact, is a tradition of local self-government. And, it is not it's not the bad kind of democracy that Plato and others have talked about, but it certainly is a question of a virtuous people being able to run their own lives in their local communities and not being governed by some sort of special elite from centralized power.
I'm so glad you framed it that way, because one of the most troubling stories that I've read about in the past couple of weeks is this issue with Jackson, Mississippi, and the total breakdown of their fresh water, drinking water being contaminated. And when you read the Washington Post coverage of this story, every single framing of it, every single new development is portrayed as a vestige of systemic racism. And nowhere do they cover what strikes me as pretty obviously a story of incompetence and corruption. And in a lot of these places in America where you have dysfunction, it's because leaders have not adequately provided for the welfare of their people. They have been negligent. They have been corrupted and compromised by things, and they're focused on things they shouldn't be doing. But what strikes me about that coverage, it's nothing new that the Washington Post wants to focus on systemic racism, but the extent to which these types of narratives seem designed to say that big segments of the American population cannot engage in self-government. And maybe that's not the point that they are trying to make. Maybe they are trying to sow division or engage in a more extreme version of political patronage politics where they need reparations because, certain people have been treated badly. I don't know what their goal is, but to me, when I read that coverage, they are saying the self-government experiment cannot work.
You're exactly right about that. And this is something where figures like Malcolm X, for example, were actually quite correct. And Malcolm X was controversial among a lot of Black leaders during his lifetime, precisely because he was, calling for more self-responsibility and self-government within the Black community, as opposed to depending upon white liberals to provide for them. And, that's something that not only white liberals didn't want to hear, but also a lot of Black leaders who were in a position to get a lot of money from white liberals, they too wanted to make sure that this message didn't get out. And this is something that comes up, time and time again. And you look at a lot of not just Black conservatives, but you can look at someone like Chuck D, for example, from the hip hop group Public Enemy. Chuck D is a guy of the left, of course, but he's someone who, because he talks about the need for Black self-sufficiency, is oftentimes sort of criticized and marginalized by the progressive left, by again a nexus of white liberals and Black leaders who together like to see Black weakness. They like to see Black communities like that in Jackson, Mississippi, unable to have clean drinking water and unable to control the crime problem, which Jackson, Mississippi, it's worse than Guatemala. Their crime rates are actually higher than that of most high crime, third world countries. And it's because you have a completely incompetent local government. And, you have a whole wide variety of systemic failures that have been imposed upon them. A lot of them, being that instead of having to get things under control locally, they have been encouraged to look to, handouts from Washington, D.C. They've been encouraged to, blame problems on, sort of white racism as opposed to on crime that is taking place in their own community. And when you do that, you get people who are, of course, they're going to have failed local civic institutions. And it's a vicious circle, because when you have these local civic institutions fail, that is then something that the liberals will say, this proves that there is systemic racism. This proves that America is a terrible country. And therefore, in order to redeem America, you must give us more power. When you give them more power, what do you get? You get more failure, more skyrocketing murder rates, more unclean drinking water. And then the Democrats just go back to their base and say yet again, this proves our case. Give us even more power. This cycle of dependency and failure and crime will never be broken until people in local communities, including local Black communities, say to liberals, no, we're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to do things, locally. We're not going to look to, some sort of liberal power network as being a kind of excuse for failure in Jackson, Mississippi.
Right. And I think of such a good illustration of that was this local or state reporter covering Mississippi issues who declared without any evidence that the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi was simply the result of systemic racism. And I was thinking, you are the journalist covering these issues. Where were you, anticipating any of this, studying what was going on in Jackson, Mississippi? Now you're just parachuting in with your diagnosis when you're the person who had the responsibility to help people understand what was going on in their community and help be a voice for the truth and to be a source of information. Speaking of systemic failures, it would not be an episode of This Is Your Country if we did not talk a little bit about globalization. So I really like how you put this in an excellent essay that you wrote in First Things from 2019. Quote, instead of viewing post-Cold War China as a rising rival, America's elites saw the remaining communist superpower as a land of opportunity for themselves. The original rationale for America to pursue a global economic order had vanished. Yet instead of once again focusing on the economic interests of America's workers, the country's leaders committed themselves to universal liberalism. The result was a political backlash. The Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot campaigns of 1992 and 1996 featured pitched battles in Congress over most favored nation status for China, and street protests against the World Trade Organization in 1999, the quote, Battle of Seattle. But the backlash was undercut by a decade's worth of technology-driven prosperity. And rather than conceding that the critics had a point, the consensus in Washington pushed ever further ahead. That led to a plunge in American industrial employment after 2000 as China was fully welcomed into the world economy. Members of the credentialed class like to depict Trump's voters as nostalgic for an America that is never coming back. If anything, it is our leaders that are nostalgic for the 1990s and deep in denial. Globalization was relatively pain-free during the 1990s because going into that decade, Americans did not know what would happen next. So, obviously, globalization's chickens have come home to roost. Dan, in your mind, what explains the political establishment's ignorance, negligence, and even malpractice, letting these issues fester so severely, both from a policy standpoint, as in not changing how they were governing the country, but also not changing how they were campaigning, just totally ignoring and dismissing and letting the electorate become increasingly ignored and disaffected.
Yeah, it's a combination of arrogance and self-interest. So they stood to make a lot of money by basically liquidating the American middle class and investing their resources in places like China, not just China, but a lot of the developing world. Because, if you're hiring workers who are making, a third or less of what Americans had to be paid, if you own the company, you can suddenly make a tremendous, gain in terms of how many workers you're able to employ for the same dollar, how much output you're able to get for the same amount of capital you're putting in. And of course, when you go to the third world for your factories, you're dealing with a much lighter regulatory environment as well. Not only that, but also these third world countries would often find various ways of subsidizing the factories that were being built in their countries. So as a result, you have wages being undercut, you have regulations protecting workers and the environment, those are also being undercut, and you have actual subsidies. Sometimes they're done very cleverly, but in effect, you have these, developing countries that are subsidizing the transfer of industry to their countries from the advanced industrialized world, especially the United States. And our elite basically said, well, we're going to get much higher returns if we facilitate this. So our elite had every financial incentive imaginable to shift jobs and shift industries to the third world and to stop doing them here. And of course, what happened was not just that they got rid of a lot of jobs that happened to be in this country, they also created new jobs that were never in this country to begin with. And instead they said, we're going to invest in the developing world instead of investing in American employment. And right now, this is actually a major concern that even a lot of establishment economists have, and certainly all economists who are critical of the establishment, they're pointing out that there is a lack of investment in American productivity right here in America itself. And there were all these always theories that well, things would circle back around. And it's true the Chinese, they buy a lot of our public debt, but Chinese direct investment in the United States in terms of creating new industries here, that's always been rather lackluster. So we've seen that we really have not, gained in terms of our productive capacity, in terms of our workforce, through these globalized, procedures. We have perhaps gotten, cheap flat screen TVs and a number of other consumer goods, but I think economists are really, they have brainwashed themselves into believing that if you simply add up the savings, supposedly, coming from the number of flat screen TVs that consumers are buying, and the dollars figure for that, the just the number of savings that you have from adding up all these consumer goods, that outweighs the amount of lost wages from the transfer of jobs. That as long as the number of that represents consumer gains is larger than the number that represents worker losses, that you therefore have an overall benefit for the American economy. But that's only true in the most sort of abstract and meaningless way. When you actually look at local communities, when you actually look at human beings and say, is losing a job more or less traumatic for you than having to pay $100 extra for your TV? Everyone is going to say it's much worse to lose your job than it is to have more expensive consumer goods. So the economists are wrong there because they are evaluating things only in terms of the most superficial dollar values and not in terms of the way in which dollars actually translate into livelihoods and lived experience for American citizens. And of course, the economists present themselves as being interested in overall efficiencies of economics and not interested particularly in Americans or in the American workforce or in citizens. And so this, too, just as an ideological commitment, as a theoretical, philosophical commitment from economists and from a number of other policy thinkers, is it's fundamentally anti-national, anti-citizen, and against the idea of even having a country that is distinct from other countries. Instead, they want to have, on ideological grounds, a world market. The world market, of course, needs to have world rules because markets do need rules. And so a world market also tends to imply you're going to have a global police force, a global set of regulatory institutions. And so globalism, we have some libertarian friends who like to think of it as just a purely sort of free market process. In fact, it isn't that at all. It is a form of creating world government step by step. And economic integration is only one part of a much larger process.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up about the factors that are lacking when economists do these calculations about the gains of globalism and the relative losses of offshoring and so on. Because in a previous episode, I covered that a huge amount of the analysis that they furnished for things like NAFTA and China joining the WTO and the subsequent tremendous offshoring of American industry, huge amounts of that analysis have been debunked as based on incorrect assumptions, even based on assumptions that they knew were incorrect at the time. And they were simply working to furnish propaganda to justify this doctrine rather than actually engaging in any meaningful empirical study. So I thought that was interesting how you described it as a liquidation of the middle class. And that reminds me of this other passage in your First Things essay. I really appreciated how you described this element of our political landscape that I think has only worsened since you wrote it just 2 or 3 years ago. The question of how our leaders regard certain sectors of the American public. Quote, the bipartisan elite's policy program for the near future amounts to shoring up its own privileges with respect to intellectual property and bureaucratic know-how, while fragmenting and buying off the urban service class with identity politics. For the unproductives, the elite prescribes what might be called, quote, palliative liberalism, involving wage subsidies, tax credits, and other measures short of restoring inherent dignity and power to work. Palliative liberalism is not the same thing as the old welfare liberalism. The welfare state of the 20th century was, at least in America, meant to be only an adjunct to a productive private economy in which almost all could participate. Palliative liberalism, on the other hand, aims not to repair labor-capital relations, but to euthanize, as humanely as possible, millions of economically unneeded and politically retrograde Americans. So, the first thing that comes to mind when I read this is the massive push for legalized cannabis, and coupled with the vehement insistence by many leftist leaders that we do not need to reduce the amount of drug addiction and death in this country. We simply need, quote, harm reduction policies where the government facilitates drug addiction. I don't think that you could find a better example of, quote unquote, palliative liberalism than that. But could you please go into the sort of the economic trends, the political trends, what led you to come up with that phrase in this framework?
Yeah, one might think that if a population has been selected by the ruling class in a country for elimination, that the immediate thing that comes to mind is, of course, Nazi Germany and its Holocaust against Jews and against other undesirables. People might also think of something like the Soviet Union, which targeted basically wealthy peasants, small business owners and others, people that identified as kulaks, and put them in re-education camps and concentration camps. And the Soviet Union claimed to be much more humane than Nazi Germany. They said, well, we're not doing this to kill these people. We're just doing it to, first of all, eliminate bad people who are introducing inequality into our society. So obviously we have to take them out if we want to have a more equal society. But we're not actually going to, send them to gas chambers and do what Nazi Germany did. Instead, we're just going to work them to death. And we're going to send them to, the mines or send them to, physical labor and out in Siberia. And we're just going to, not feed them very much. And we're going to, have them work for the common, supposedly the common good. And if they happen to drop dead, while they're working, well, gosh, that's just the terrible fate of humanity in a world that isn't yet perfect, but it will be perfect once we communists, have our way. Well, these, sort of Nazi and communist examples are the most dramatic forms of how you get rid of a population that you don't like. But in America, we have our own way of doing things, according to liberal canons of conduct and progressive canons of conduct. So we don't like to go out there and say, we're going to kill you or we're going to work you to death. Instead, we say, well, if your life just happens to become so unbearable that you want to kill yourself, gosh, we really feel so sad for you, but we'll help you do that. So euthanasia is a very big part of the liberal program. And obviously, they start out with what is for them the easy cases, right? So if you have someone who is suffering from a terrible disease, then they're in constant pain and they're never going to recover. Liberals say, well, this is what euthanasia is for. We're saying it's only for the most extreme cases. But then in practice, when you see what's actually put into play, and we've had some stories out of Canada recently that make this case, it turns out that they're actually going to use euthanasia against people who are just depressed, even people who might not be depressed, who are just going through some bad times. They're going to say, well, maybe you're depressed, maybe because you're going blind or something, your quality of life is going to continue to deteriorate. Don't you think maybe you should kill yourself, or we should kill you, we should help you, end your life? And they will actually tell you, and this is, again, the story that came out of Canada this past month. The Canadian Health Service was going to patients and was telling them, well, we think your quality of life is not going to improve. And you realize, of course, that you're a burden on everyone right now because we have to, provide you with medication. We have to kind of help you with services if you're going blind. It's going to be better for everyone, especially you, if you're just not around anymore. So euthanasia is, a very concrete way in which liberalism wants to dispose of people it considers to be useless and burdensome. But before you get to the point of euthanasia, you have all the other things which you and I have alluded to. So encouraging, for example, drug use recreationally. Well, what does this say? It says that your life is basically aimless, purposeless. You have no reason to be connecting with other human beings. Instead, what you need is simply pharmaceutical relief from your problems. And of course, they make this pitch on two different levels. There is the pitch that is simply recreational street drugs, saying, well, look, naturally, of course, you're going to be bored living in your community in Pennsylvania. Right now, this John Fetterman guy who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania, this Democrat, he has this long history of calling for legalization of drugs, marijuana, etc. And Fetterman himself is this guy who, he seems kind of working class, just physically, he's this big bald guy with tattoos and whatnot. But of course, he also represents kind of the plight of the working class. And this is something which symbolically appeals to a lot of voters. That's why Fetterman has any kind of chance at all of getting elected to the Senate. But what Fetterman's policies are actually calling for is basically for the working class to narcotize itself and make itself sort of more passive and submissive and less capable of taking care of itself and more dependent upon government services. These government services are then doled out, and that makes you even more miserable because now, again, just like in the Canadian case, you see, oh, I'm not working, I'm just living as a ward of the state. Or if I am working, I'm getting a lot of subsidies from government in order to have a job. Um, so it's a way of encouraging dependency, which then leads to depression, and depression then leads to a case for euthanasia. And when I lay it out, just there in 30 seconds or 60 seconds, it sounds very melodramatic. And it's like, Dan, how can you possibly be saying that this is actually something that is systematically being done? But what you have to realize, it's very subtle, and each step of the way is logical. And again, it's not a matter of some evil genius having a master plan that is imposing this. It's rather that at each step of the way, the liberal ideology, the progressive ideology tells liberals what the correct action should be. And the correct action is always to take these populations, which again are the populations that basically built Western civilization. And they're being told, well, you can't compete with Chinese labor. Chinese people are just much more industrious. Indian people are much more brilliant than you are. So you always see libertarians at the Cato Institute say that Americans, they just can't start any companies themselves. All of our best companies are started by immigrants. And therefore, we must have, open borders. We must have a lot more immigration. And America's native workforce, for some mysterious reason, is just completely lacking in entrepreneurial spirit. And libertarians will say, well, we think that this is just the way things naturally are. Progressives on the left, they will say, well, because this is the way things are, we have to basically, treat Americans in the working class as clients and give them a lot of government services and, ultimately encourage them to become medical wards of the state. And ultimately, we're going to take care of the end of their lives. Now, when I say all this, I'm not saying that immigrants who are very entrepreneurial and create new businesses are bad or anything like that. You always see leftists, including, unfortunately, a lot of neoconservatives and libertarians and others who would say that the kinds of things I've just said are just, sort of purely race-based and all that, which is not the case at all. I actually want to see us take care of our citizens. And citizenship is a legal, concept. It's something that includes Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, the whole panoply. All of these Americans have been working very hard and have been getting screwed over by our leadership for a very long time. We need to take care of Americans first, and then we can take in, some of the best immigrants around the world when we have a America that is doing a better job of making its citizens more self-dependent, more self-reliant, more, that we have more industry and productivity in this country, more of an entrepreneurial spirit in this country. Once we've revived our own citizenry, then we can start taking on the best people from around the world. But until we do that, what we're basically doing is saying, we're going to let parts of the American workforce, Black as well as white, of course, basically rot. They're going to have a kind of living death experience where they just become written off by the elites, and the elites say, oh, these are just worthless people. You have to take care of them. You have to give them, some degree of support, but you never expect them to become productive members of society. You just expect them to go ahead and absorb whatever, sort of medical disability leave or other things they might be getting from government at the local and federal levels. You just write them off, basically. They're just Americans who have to be, again, given palliative care until they happen to die off. Those people can be written off, and instead what we want is a completely new workforce, a completely new body of citizens. And the reason they do that, of course, is because when new citizens come in, they don't know anything about the country's traditions and history, for the most part. They undergo some civics training as part of a citizenship course. But of course, if you have illegal immigration, they're not getting any of that kind of civics training. Instead, what they're getting is indoctrination by progressives who control American public education and the American media, who are told, well, the most important thing you need to know about America when you come in as an immigrant is that America is unjust, and America is unfair to people of color, to women, to everyone else, and that therefore, the only right thing to do is to support left-wing progressive Democrats and neoconservatives and left-wing, cultural libertarians and whatnot, because these are the good people who want to take care of you and to have open borders. Whereas, Americans who want to, put American citizens first, they are bad people who have always been oppressing, through colonialism and imperialism and exploitation of, every population within this country. They're the bad people. And so you shouldn't feel any, sort of guilt or any reservations about seeing, declining life expectancy, for example, among American citizens, which right now, it's just shocking. I mean, life expectancy in America now is lower, I think, than it is for China, certainly for the Chinese middle class. We are in the process. I mean, this is literally killing off your own citizenry. And this is happening. But what is our leadership class doing about it? They're adopting just more of the same policies.
That's right. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that framing of being pro-citizen. You're in good company. That's a central thesis of this is your country, that we need to improve our country, improve what we're doing for our citizens by focusing on their material welfare, focusing on the cohesion of this country and the opportunities for people, and the refocus our national decision making on the welfare of our citizens as opposed to ideological commitments and even these more sort of sinister things. And as you say, you are not exaggerating what's going on when you refer to this type of thing as palliative liberalism. As I say, when I was doing this research on quote unquote harm reduction policies to deal with drug addiction, the New York Times, in writing up the Biden administration's pro harm reduction policies, they say it's unusual to have an addiction, management strategy that does not explicitly say our goal is to reduce the number of people taking drugs and dying from them. That is not even their stated goal. And so this is not us speculating, us developing theories about what conspiracies they may be up to. This was explicitly written in the New York Times, and they were trying to disguise their shock a little bit too. So I want to pivot also to the upcoming issue of the midterm elections, because against all of this, which is so dehumanizing, so dysfunctional, so demoralizing, what explains the Republicans' seeming lack of a platform, their inability to commit to an inspiring agenda of policy deliverables and to develop inspiring messaging?
Yeah, a lot of Republicans jumped on the Trump bandwagon while Trump was president, but they never really meant it. And so you have a Republican Party which is presenting itself as being a kind of populist, Trumpian party, but in fact is still the same old Republican Party that it was during the Bush years, simply doing a little bit of rebranding. And because it's all insincere, these Republicans don't actually understand what a real populist message would sound like. It's not just that they don't understand the particular positions that it would take. They don't understand the emotional registers that they should be invoking in order to connect with the public. And so even when they go out there and say the right policies, people can tell that it's, all superficial, that it's not being generated by an internal, sort of set of values that commit these would-be policymakers or these would-be members of Congress to a certain, sort of a principled view of American citizens as, being the people they should be serving. Then instead it's just, okay, this is the new checklist I have to, mark off in order to win a Republican primary or to win a general election. Just as, in the Bush years, they had a different checklist, but that's all. That's as deep as they go. It's just a checklist. It's just something they do in order to get to where they need to go. And, again, people will think, so you're saying politicians are just these really cunning cynics who always, deliberately shift with the wind. It's not even that. A lot of these people are just dumb and they can't think for themselves and they don't have, very deep values. And so they're not very good at coming up with new ideas that are based upon those values. Instead, they just have to take whatever ideas are floating around, in the media or in right-wing media as well as in progressive media. So they will take ideas that they hear from, Donald Trump making a speech or from Fox News, from Tucker Carlson or whatever. But that's as far as it goes. They know the slogans, they may know, the individual policies, but they don't actually know the kind of emotional as well as intellectual and philosophical commitments that are meant to be generating those policies in the first place. That's one reason that I think a book like Wilmore Kendall's The Conservative Affirmation is so valuable, because I think if people in the conservative grassroots read this book, they will more deeply understand the, sort of the heart and the core of the American project and the American constitutional order. And they'll be able then to say, aha, I don't have to be embarrassed that I'm a conservative who is an American and who wants to put Americans first. As a conservative, I don't have to be a monarchist. I don't have to be, someone who thinks that we should never have had the American Revolution and that we should have stayed, as part of the British Empire or something like that. Instead, that America has a tradition of self-government, a tradition of putting American citizens first, giving them power to determine the limits of, rights claims within their own communities. That this is actually the matrix that generates self-government at the congressional level, self-government at the sort of gubernatorial and the state level. If you don't understand all of that, if you think that all of this is just talking points that comes from the right television program, and again, I don't mean that as any criticism of Tucker or anyone else. I'm just saying that I think our own side needs to deepen its understanding of its own roots, and if it doesn't have that understanding, it's going to continue to generate policies that seem like they have no real depth to them. And there's a limit to how much politicians will ever intellectually commit to something. But certainly the grassroots needs to do this, and then the grassroots can keep the politicians' feet to the fire. I'm moderately optimistic, actually, about the midterms. I don't know about the scale of the wave, and people tend to get a little bit ahead of themselves in terms of making predictions. But I do think the Republicans are going to retake the House, and I think they will also retake the Senate. The problem is, as you say, what kind of agenda and program are Republicans going to have? And it really needs to be the program and agenda that Donald Trump spelled out in 2016. And in addition to that, it needs to really tackle the crime crisis that we have right now. And those, should be the primary concerns. Whereas, as you alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, yes, we should certainly be tackling the excesses of the left in the culture war. But I fear that the Republicans are going to get into a position where people think, well, the Republican Party is just the drag queen story hour party. It doesn't have any issues or any, understanding of the public concerns beyond just drag queen story hour. I mean, think about the way in which the left is brilliant at this, right? Joe Biden does not campaign on pushing drag queen story hour on kids. Nancy Pelosi, when she's trying to get a congressional majority, she doesn't go out and, say, aha, here's our contract with America, and it's going to be gender reassignment for, 11-year-olds plus drag queen story hour for all children. They go out there and they say, no, we're about the minimum wage. We're about relieving student debt. It's all of these bread and butter issues. And of course, there's plenty of flaws with those bread and butter issues, but you can see why ordinary people would say, aha, I need relief from student debt. I need to have, higher wages. I'm going to go vote Democrat. They vote Democrat, and then what they actually get, of course, is all the culture war stuff. Well, Republicans are quite right that if they identify how unpopular the culture war stuff is, and they say what you're actually getting when you vote for Joe Biden is drag queen story hour and hysterectomies for 11-year-olds, this will enrage voters, and voters will go to the polls. That's correct. But look at how the left is also able to sort of get Republicans to think they've gone far enough, when in fact the Republicans have kind of painted themselves into a corner. Because what you wind up with is, while voters do get outraged up to a certain point, voters are also turned off by the fact that it's always Republicans talking about the drag queens. And a lot of normal people just don't want to hear anything about drag queens ever. So even though they do want to have some of these, excesses exposed, they also wind up thinking that the Republicans are obsessed with drag queens and gays and other stuff, and that the Republicans have nothing to say about bread and butter economic issues, about inflation, about, the terrible things that are happening in our foreign policy, about, our, crime in the streets. So while the culture war is very, very important, and I think that people like Chris Rufo, for example, are some of the greatest heroes in our movement right now, I also think that Republicans, they get so interested in some of these sensational issues that they wind up neglecting a lot of the other issues, the bread and butter stuff that American voters care about the most.
That is exactly my issue with the cultural issue framing, is that Republicans get baited into silliness and frivolousness, not because those issues are not important, but because fundamentally it is a propaganda dispute. It's sensationalism, as you say, and it's symptomatic of something that needs to be addressed with with greater depth, and with more connecting these outcomes to the substantial policies that need to be changed or need to be addressed. So I totally agree with you. That was very well said. So wrapping things up, my last question, in the same First Things essay from 2019, you wrote, quote, "Our present predicament is the result of letting political thought run on autopilot too long." And it really struck me that I thought we would have a very clear paradigm shift after the coronavirus hysteria, the 2020 BLM extortion riots, and the really galling election malfeasance that I believe we witnessed in 2020. I thought that there would be a huge backlash to that politically, of people saying, what is going on in my country? I don't have control over things. We cannot take for granted many of our institutions. Everything ranging from the supply chain difficulties, where people couldn't get a sofa for 18 months, to the question of whether you drop a ballot off in the middle of the sidewalk and someone, I guess, comes along and picks it up and says that this is legitimate. So, but we didn't see one. I think that there is a lot of that sentiment in voters. They're becoming more jaded by the extent of totalizing propaganda that was forced upon them in 2020. But I am not seeing politicians adapt to channel that very well. So In your opinion, how do you pull off a paradigm shift in American politics today? It seems like the will of the people is there. It's going totally unaddressed and even unexploited, which is a term I don't really like to use, but you would think that an intelligent politician would take advantage of that.
Yeah, so much of this attests to the power of miseducation. So, our leadership class, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense right now, our leaders, not only in government, but also in the private sector, in the business world, and journalism, they've all not only, gotten an undergraduate education from our universities, but a lot of them also have advanced degrees. And I forget the particular statistic that a friend of mine pointed out to me a couple of years ago, but the number of members of Congress who have advanced degrees is quite staggering. It's a very high percentage. And as a result, they just have a different mentality. They have different fundamental commitments and presuppositions about how the world works than ordinary American workers and ordinary American families. So what you have right now is that all of these college educated people have been taught, oh, this is the way economics works. And if you do anything different, if you question free trade, for example, you're an idiot. I mean, you can't even be taken seriously, let alone can you be a good person who's actually trying to do something right for your fellow citizens. And across the board, if you question systemic racism, for example, there too, you are a bad person and you're also an idiot. You just don't understand the current state of the science. Same thing, of course, with the gender ideology. I mean, it's remarkable to see how Republicans themselves, conservatives themselves, continue to shift along with the rest of the country, with the rest of the elite, I should say. That things that only the far left says at one point, 20 years later, you will find just absolutely conventional college-educated conservatives endorsing themselves. So I wish I had a solution to this massive education problem, because the fact is people with college degrees are going to continue to have disproportionate power in our country for a very long time. Not only do I not see any kind of new institutions arising among people without college educations, but to the extent that you have things like an uptick in the labor union movement, it's going to be the worst possible form of the labor union movement. I mean, the one thing that you could say about the old-fashioned labor unions is that because they involved a lot of working-class guys, they had a lot of cultural predispositions that were not very left-wing, even if they were being, co-opted into service of left-wing economic agendas. Whereas today, if you unionize people, in retail, for example, you're just not going to have that same sort of mentality among the people who are unionized as you had before. So it's going to wind up extorting businesses, but it will not actually produce the kinds of cultural friction within the Democratic coalition that you had before. So what can be done? Well, the first thing I think is that we do have to become, we have to engage in more autodidacticism. We have to engage in more self-education. We have to also continue to value above almost anything else our right to keep and bear arms. What you'll notice is that the right to keep and bear arms is important not just for its own sake, not just because Americans need to be able to, provide for their own defense and not be dependent upon some outside force, including Washington, D.C., as being the primary defender, but also because responsible use of firearms builds character. And the attack on firearms right now is being done by taking all of these psychologically damaged young men who go on these murder sprees with an AR-15. And these kids are clearly, sort of seriously troubled long before they get a firearm in their hands. And again, the question is, why is it that, people who are obviously as messed up as these kids are not already subject to, some kind of intervention, some kind of control long before they get to the point where they can start killing people? And in fact, what we find out is that the few interventions that they get are things that tend to actually exacerbate things. So, there's a lot of conflicting arguments about the degree to which psychotropic medication contributes to these spree killings. But clearly, this medication that some of these kids are given certainly is not stopping them, and it may, in fact, be contributing to the kind of detachment from humanity that these mass murderers feel. But for ordinary people, which is the vast majority of firearms owners and firearms users, ordinary people, their character is enhanced by firearms ownership. And it gives them a sense of you as a citizen are powerful, you can defend yourself, and you have to take responsibility. You cannot rely completely on others. And you also, you realize that you can hurt people, which means you have to be sensitive in how you deal with people. You have to be respectful to people. And an armed culture can be a very respectful culture in a way that a culture where people feel weak and dependent and vulnerable not only do they then defer to people they shouldn't defer to, like, muggers and criminals, but they also wind up, being angry just about their place in life because, again, they feel powerless, and they are sort of powerless. So something as simple as the Second Amendment, using our First Amendment rights robustly to say things that are, politically incorrect, to say things that may be uncomfortable, say things that even a lot of other conservatives don't want to say, that too builds strength. You have to be willing to actually exercise your rights in a way that shows that you are a daring citizen, have a degree of, initiative. And if you don't do that, then everything else is going to fail. But that's only the first beginning. Once you have citizens who have that degree of initiative and that degree of self-responsibility, they then have to create institutions that are effective. I have some hopes that the Republican Party is slowly learning its lessons. And certainly it's been great to see a proliferation of conservative new media like your program, for example, developing. And a New Founding, which I know is a supporter of this program, is the sponsor of the program. I think it is an extremely promising new initiative. And these things are very bright beginnings. So I'm not discouraged by the fact that things have not improved as much as we would like them to improve, because, I remember how dark things looked back in the George W. Bush days, when it was very clear that the neocons were in full control, and there was really nothing to resist the left. And even though, you had George W. Bush nominally opposing things like gay marriage or abortion, in fact, he was putting people like John Roberts on the Supreme Court, and you were continuing to get, the country's left-wing drift. Today, the fact that we have any resistance at all, and the fact that you have someone like Donald Trump out there, and someone like, Ron DeSantis, who I think is doing a good job in Florida, this is all very encouraging to me. And I actually think this is a massive improvement over where we were 15 years ago.
Yes, I think that's really well said. I'm optimistic as well. And I'm really glad that you said that about the miseducation of our elites, because I encounter so often even people elected to public office who have very little knowledge of the empirical evidence of how certain policies work, even just the status quo. They don't know things about employment and unemployment and wages and different sectors of our economy. And that's why I try deliberately on this program to focus, to tether all of this policy analysis, this commentary, our political studies to the empirical evidence of what is going on and how did we get there, what contributed to it, because that really is a central form of education that we need to engage in if we are trying to fix these problems and cobble together a political movement that can fix a lot of these issues. So I think that wraps it up. Dan, I'm so pleased that you joined us. You are so well informed about so many different issues, and I really, really enjoyed this interview. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paige. I really enjoyed it, and your show is doing great work.
I appreciate it. Till next time. I'm so glad that Dan mentioned that our side needs to deepen its understanding of our values to inform a more substantial policy platform and to deliver for our voters, to draw in the American people as midterms approach and in future elections. I think we are right to be hard on our leaders, to be hard on our politicians, to channel the will of the people and deliver for our country. Thank you, as always, for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey.